In this video, we are going to talk about using a dialectical approach to better understand intercultural communication. There are three characteristics or assumptions of the dialectical approach that I want to discuss. First, the dialectical approach assumes that in our complex world, cultures and people can and do change. In fact, it's assumed that we are in such a constant state of change that we really can't come to know anything, because the second that something happens, it's changed not only the people but the context around it, so that thing that we once thought was true is no longer really true anymore. Now, clearly some events are more consequential than others. Nonetheless, this dialectic reminds us that nothing is stagnant. The world and the people within the world are dynamic and ever-changing. The dialectical approach also asks us to be aware of and embrace the complexity and interconnectedness of the world around us. The image on your screen shows the European Central Bank network. The network pictured captures the ways in which different banks and bank branches interact with their sister branches in other countries. As the network graph clearly shows, the European banking system is definitely complex and interconnected. As I know nothing about European banking, I'm going to move on to the final characteristic of the dialectical approach, which is the idea that the dialectical approach asks us to be okay with the sometimes contradictory ways in which communication experiences happen. You see, in the United States, we're taught to think about things in absolutes. There's good and there's evil. There's a winner, so there has to be a loser. Someone is right and someone's wrong. The only problem with thinking this way is that most of the time we can't really classify things into absolute categories. Things can be both good and bad, or they can be good for some people while they're bad for other people. So, Darth Vader can be both the evil villain and the hero's father. Recognizing that we are many times asked to hold contradictory ideas simultaneously, it's important to try and think of concepts using a both-and orientation rather than an either-or orientation. When we do this, we're accepting that something can be both one thing and another at the same time. For example, we have to think about things using the both-and orientation when we think about Walter White. In AMC's Breaking Bad, Walter White is simultaneously a husband, father, and high school chemistry teacher who's battling cancer, and a drug kingpin who produces meth. These two identities contradict one another, and it's precisely that contradiction that made the show fun to watch. In the end, viewers of the show were left to consider whether Walter was the hero or the villain. He began manufacturing meth so that he could pay for his cancer treatments and leave some money for his family were he to pass away. So was his decision to manufacture meth right, or was it wrong? There are no clear-cut answers in the case of Walter White. The truth behind the rightness or wrongness of his actions depends on the worldview of the individual who's assessing it. We can't easily say if Walter was either good or evil, but we can more easily discuss the idea that Walter was both good and evil. If we embrace the contradictions that dialectical theories ask us to, we recognize that we have to see things as capable of being both this and that. Now that we've discussed the assumptions underlying the dialectical approach, I want to talk about 6 dialectics that your textbook authors identify in one of their other intercultural communication textbooks. Dialectics are methods of logic based on the principle that an idea generates its opposite, leading to a reconciliation of those opposites. In essence, when we look to dialectics, we accept that there's a complex and oftentimes paradoxical relationship between the two concepts that describe the dialectic. When I talk about dialectical terms, I'm talking about those terms like good and evil, right and wrong, just and unjust. So when we think of dialectical terms, a lot of times we'll put them on opposite ends of a spectrum. So those terms become anchors on a continuum. While we tend to do this because we conceptualize those terms as opposites, we want to be cautious of doing that, because when we place things on opposing ends of a spectrum, we're really not recognizing the fact that something could be simultaneously good and evil. So even though those terms are considered opposites, something can simultaneously possess some goodness and some evilness. What then are the dialectics that Martin and Nakayama identify in their Intercultural Communication and Context textbook? The first dialectic is the cultural individual dialectic. And this dialectic reminds us that while we share cultural patterns with the groups to which we belong, for example, our families, we also have communication characteristics that are unique to us as individuals. For example, cultural expectations indicate that women should be caring and compassionate. I display these cultural ideals in the classroom as I strive to really figure out where students are coming from and who they are when I interact with them. While I might let my students know that I'm a caring and compassionate individual when we interact in classroom situations, when I'm grading assignments, I tend to be really logical, and I pay attention to the work that's on the page without really considering the individual who produced the work. So while I possess those stereotypically feminine norms when I'm in the classroom, I do not necessarily use that part of my identity when I'm grading work. The second dialectic is the personal contextual dialectic. And this dialectic highlights the importance of context by forcing us to simultaneously consider the person and the context in which an interaction is occurring. For example, I tend to be relatively lax when interacting with upperclassmen. While I prefer my first and second year students to call me Dr. Knudsen, I'm not bothered if a junior or senior student were to call me Chris. That being said, were I to teach in a country other than the United States, I might not be able to let my students call me by my first name. In some contexts, personal choices about how interaction ought to happen get trumped by social norms. The third dialectic is the differences-similarity dialectic. This dialectic recognizes that people are both similar to and different from each other. For example, we tend to believe that men are logical and women are emotional. While we might expect that these similarities exist in the world, we all also likely know people who are different. Thus, we know women who are not at all emotional. My sister, for example, doesn't cry even when she's watching the saddest movie ever. Similarly, we know men who are absolute softies. What we need to remember is that if we only focus on the ways that people are different, we might begin stereotyping people in problematic ways. Additionally, if we only focus on the ways that people are similar, we might begin ignoring some of the cultural differences that make us unique and exciting. Thus, as we move forward, this dialectic reminds us that we have to be constantly searching for both the things that make us similar to and different from those who we interact with. The fourth dialectic is the static dynamic dialectic. And that dialectic reminds us that things can be simultaneously stagnant and changing. Some cultural patterns seem unchangeable and lasting, while others are able to change over time. For example, the fact that the U.S. tends to be anti-immigrant has been a constant across time, while the groups that U.S. citizens have opposed immigrating to this country have changed. The fifth dialectic is the past, present, future dialectic. To understand the world around us, we have to be aware of both what has happened and what is currently happening. What has been, what is being, and what will be are all related concepts, and we can't really understand one of them without paying attention to the others. The sixth and final dialectic we're going to discuss is the privilege-disadvantage dialectic. This dialectic reminds us that people can be privileged in some context while they're disadvantaged in others. For example, many tourists are privileged because they can afford to travel, yet when they're overseas they can be disadvantaged if they don't speak the language of the country they're visiting. Likewise, I have a college professor friend who happens to be biracial. Her biracial identity is a minority identity, while her identity as a college professor with tenure is a privileged identity because she has access to knowledge that others do not, as well as a socioeconomic class standing that places her above others. I hope you all have come to better understand the dialectical approach to intercultural communication. If you have any questions about this video, please post them to the D2L discussion forum for lecture questions.